Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride, and the reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and proud of it. Today I'm going to talk about the border, and if you've been watching my show lately, and I don't think too many have, but a few, I've had a webcam behind me for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Today's webcam is of the border, but it's the Canadian border, the longest border that the United States has. Do illegal aliens and border problems occur at that border? They sure do, because the Canadian border is the only border that's actually had a terrorist come across it that was caught with explosives in his car. That happened right before the Millennium Celebration in the year 1999, right before New Year's Eve of 2000. He was going to blow up the LA airport. So there's border problems, but it's not unique to the Mexican border, although that seems to be what everybody's talking about. I'm going to close my tie over here, or my shirt. Anyway, so what are we talking about? Well, today is Friday. By the time you see it, again, I'll be talking about old news. There's been a lot of action in the Senate. The House passed a bill that basically makes being an illegal alien or a foreigner without documents felony, which it's not now. A lot of people are talking about how illegal immigration is, and what they don't realize is right now, without this change in the law, and that change in the law hasn't passed, being an undocumented immigrant is at this point just a civil offense. It doesn't mean you can't be deported because you're not here legally. They can definitely put you in a car or a plane and ship you back across the border, but there's no real penalties to it. It's not even a misdemeanor. So everybody's talking about these are criminals and they have no respect, or illegal aliens and all this other stuff, which is true, but there's no criminal penalty applied to it right now, and that's one of the reasons we have 11 or 12 million undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens, or whatever you want to call them nowadays. And I don't know what to call them, really. So there's been a gigantic debate. This House bill passed a while ago, and there's been a lot of reaction to it. There's been gigantic demonstrations against it in various communities. In LA, there was 500,000 people demonstrated against it. In Phoenix, on Monday, it's probably going to be 100,000, maybe another 10,000 here in Tucson, which, if you're watching it on Sunday, would be the next day, would be tomorrow. But I'm not going to call it tomorrow because I'm not doing this on Sunday. This is live to tape. It's being taped on Friday. So what's just happened? What just happened today is yesterday there was a compromise in the Senate where they're going to pass a bill, and the Republican leadership approved it, that was put together by Mr. Hagel, who's an ally of John McCain, where aliens or undocumenteds or whatever you want to call them on either side of the issue, we're going to be allowed to, if they've been here over 5 years, to actually put in the paperwork for legal residency that could eventually lead to citizenship, but they would have to get into the line for citizenship after the legal immigrants were done. So it'd be about 11 years all told to get to legality for these immigrants. For people from 2 to 5, they can go right to the border, pass, basically step across it for 1 second, and then reapply for guest worker status right then and there, either at San Diego or El Paso. One of the big, I think there were going to be 11 different border stations where they could do this. If they were less than 2 years, goodbye, they had to go back. And that's basically what it is. Now, everybody identifies undocumented aliens and so on and so forth as mostly being Mexican. It's true, 60% are, 7.2 million Mexicans out of 11 million, maybe 12, it's hard to say. A lot of the rest are other Latin Americans, Central Americans, El Salvador, Honduras, you name it, and some South Americans. And then the other 10% are from the rest of the world. Oddly enough, there's a lot of Irish. Apparently up to 50 to 100,000 Irishmen are undocumented immigrants as well. And very few from the rest of the countries in Europe, because people in Europe don't really want to come to the United States except as students or businessmen and so on and so forth. And they can get, there are other legal avenues for them. And let's face it, visas are easier for them. The remainder are some Middle Easterners, some Africans, and a lot of Asians who make up most of the other rest of the 10%. So 90% are Hispanics of one kind or another, and of the 90%, 60% are Mexicans. So it's just logical that the largest migrations are directly over a border. But what we don't count is all the migration that's going on from Canada and back, where Canadians are allowed to basically walk across the border. It's just a lucky thing in 1999, almost 2000, that somebody was looking, somebody questioned a person who appeared to be Middle Eastern and he was an Arab, and asked him to open it. He looked all sweaty and nervous, asked him to open his trunk, and in his trunk was full of C4 explosive. And apparently he was the key player in bringing down the explosives for a major terrorist event that was supposed to occur at the night of the millennium. As the fireworks were going off throughout the world, LA airport was going to be going up in flames with all the people that were there, all apparently to be killed. So that would have been a disaster. Of course, disaster did occur in the next terrorist attack, which was 9/11. And apparently we didn't try very hard from that moment when we did find that particular plot and break it up. And a bunch of people were arrested in Canada, by the way, who were scheduled to be coming into the United States, carry out the rest of that plot. So is Mexico the big threat? Is that the place where the threat's expected to be? It's hard to say. Or is Canada the big threat, the place where the threat's supposed to be? So this Senate bill that was going to come on, I've just heard on the radio, and of course, as I said before, today is Friday, so you would have just heard it 2 days ago, and this would be old and extremely boring news, that the Senate just postponed the vote because they couldn't get past cloture. Well, what is cloture? And here's your little bitty 10 cents of American politics. In the Senate, which is a deliberative body as opposed to a representative body, originally the Senate, not too many people know that, senators were originally picked by the state legislators. So if you had a state legislature that was Democrat, they could pick a senator, in fact, both senators, who were Democrats. And that was very, very common. That's no longer true. There was one of the amendments, and if you put it right in my face, I'm not going to remember which one, but it was early in the 20th century, transferred the Senate from a body that's appointed by the states, basically not representatives of the people, representatives of the states, and made it actually voting where the people in each state would vote for their senators in direct elections. And that's relatively new. It would be kind of neat and make the state legislators a lot more powerful if we still had a Senate that was actually picked by the legislatures themselves. It would really count big time who you voted for state senator and state House of Representatives. I have to admit, I don't pay that much attention to the local state legislature, but I'll tell you, if they were going to pick the senator, I'd be real concerned about whether that was a Democrat or a Republican, whether that was my side of the fence or somebody else's. However, that's been changed, and now we directly elect the senators, and the Senate has a system where anybody can force debate and keep on debating. It's called a filibuster. And the only way to stop debate is to get the vote of 60 senators, not a majority of 51. Well, what does this mean? This means that, in effect, a party has to have 61 senators to really be able to force its position through the Senate. So we already have a Republican president. We already have a Republican House. And in order to have total power, the Republicans would have to have 61 people in the Senate. If the Democrats have 41 and 42, it blocks. Ironically, the immigration issue is an issue that's supported by the president, supports basically a guest worker program, improves security on the border, and also a guest worker, improved security, and not an amnesty, but path to legalization, as they say, for undocumented workers or illegal aliens, if you want to get tough about it, who are here over 2 years. So there's this path that was in this bill. Now, a lot of Republicans are dead set against it, and a lot of Republicans are dead set for it. Among the ones that are for this compromise was John McCain, Hagel, and some others. Among the senators that were dead set against it are Kyle, who's also the other senator from Arizona, and Jeff Sessions of Alabama, who's really been demagoguing this thing on the other side. So what happened? Well, what happened was they couldn't get 61 votes to stop the debate. The Democrats basically said, this is our compromise. Let's vote for this compromise up or down. No, the antis can't have any amendments put into this bill, because any amendments would take out the path to legalization, which the antis are extremely against. So they don't want any path to legalization. Basically, all Mexican and other undocumented immigrants have got to go back to Mexico and wait in line to see if they can get a visa, although our visa system against Mexico is the number that are set aside are far, far below the demand for jobs for these people. So basically there's 500,000 jobs for illegal aliens, undocumented workers, whatever, from over the southern border. And they're mostly agricultural, a lot of construction, a lot of retail, back of the store kind of jobs. At one point or another in my storied career, I was the guy who put the dirty dishes into this gigantic dishwashing machine at a student cafeteria, and I was the only English-speaking person in the whole place. And this was a pretty conservative school, too. So I wouldn't be surprised if you go on campuses throughout the country, even campuses of the most conservative schools, Liberty University and who knows, although I don't know this for a fact, if anybody challenges me. And if you go back to the cafeteria, you'll probably find very few English-speaking people back there either. I don't know that for a fact, and it might be possible that they pay their folks $15 or $20 an hour in order to get only fifth or sixth generation Americans to work in the dish room, but I doubt it. So that's the situation. There are jobs for this number of people. There's only 50 or 100,000 spaces for them. So everybody else jumps the line, jumps right over the border, and we have the situation that we have. That's not good for the Mexicans that are waiting, of course, and a lot of those are people who've married American citizens or so on and so forth. And it's unfair, but that's the way it is. Two ways to fix it. One way is to increase the legal visas through a guest worker program, or just to say our quota for Mexicans is 500,000. Anybody who's a Mexican citizen, run down to the U.S. consulate and sign up because we're taking 500,000 workers for 3-year visas. The other possibility is to do what the House basically did, which is to say anybody here without documents is a felon, is going to get 5 years in jail, clog up the courts, and charge them with felonies, and let all the drug dealers and murderers out of the prisons and replace them with undocumented aliens, illegal workers, or whatever you want to call it. That's basically what the House bill is. Now, if the House bill is passed and no bill gets passed in the Senate, it's a dead letter. Nothing happens this year. Everybody stays illegal. Who doesn't have papers. It's still just a civil offense. Everything goes on just the way it's been. If the Senate passes the same bill as in the House, then we have 11 million felons who've previously been 11 million people with civil offenses. And what happens then? To be honest with you, I shudder to think. I think probably nothing. But I think there's going to be a lot of worried people. And there's going to be a lot of citizens worried because a lot of those people are uncles and dads and moms and sisters of American citizens, especially mothers and fathers, since if they have had any children on this soil, they are American citizens according to the 14th Amendment. Now, a lot of people would like to change that. A lot of people would like to say if foreigners have a child on our soil, that child is not an American citizen. Well, to be very honest with you, I've lived in a country where that is the policy, and that country is Germany, modern European country, and they have approximately 2 million Turks who've lived all their lives, born in Germany, can never be citizens. Very, very weird situation, very, very similar to ancient history when in Rome you had freemen, and in Sparta you had helots. All the people that did all the work who weren't in the army were non-citizens, and there were a few thousand citizens who of Sparta who controlled the army and the police force, and basically spent all their time when they weren't fighting the Persians or the Athenians, keeping the rest of the people who were not citizens, couldn't vote, couldn't have anything to do with civic life, and had no rights, making sure that they continued to plow the fields and to make the swords. So it's kind of an ironic situation that in a modern country like Germany, and in fact a lot of the European countries, they allow labor to come in and out. They allow laborers from the rest of Europe to have children on their soil, but those people never become citizens. And you have a very, very strange situation. Then you have France, where anybody from the French Empire can basically declare themselves citizens, come to France. So you have millions of Moroccans and Algerians and so on and so forth, and you have a hostile minority of citizens within the country who hate the place and hate everybody who already lives there, hate the French. So, and there were riots last year to prove it. So it's a very, very difficult situation. It's hard to say what is the right thing. Personally, I think we have the right thing, and we are much more successful than Europe, very much because we have a situation where we have a growing population, although growing a little bit, even with a declining birth rate because of the immigration that's coming into the country, documented or undocumented. And in Europe, you're going to have a situation where the whole continent is getting older and older and older. Some countries in Europe are so far below the replacement rate. Spain, Italy, Germany is so far below the replacement rate that their population is going to go from 80 million to 55 million if they don't bring in immigrants. And literally the country is getting 1 year, average age is getting a little less than 1 year older every single year. The reason? Germans aren't having children. This, I believe the Italians and Spanish are the lowest. They have like a 1.3 children per woman replacement rate, and a lot of the grunt labor is done by Muslim immigrants who have no right to be citizens and will never become citizens. So you have this disgruntled underclass who's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you don't have enough workers to support all the people who are retiring and going to retire, baby boom generation, and even older in the future. So Europe is in deep trouble. And one of the reasons they're in deep trouble is because they don't have a lot of legal immigration. They do have a lot of illegal immigration. And even though they share labor between European countries, all the European countries, with the exception of a few in Eastern Europe that have just joined, and they're starting to drop too, have a incredibly quickly falling birth rate. And because of this birth rate, they're going to be in deep trouble. Now, oddly enough, this concept of a falling birth rate, that's spread to Japan, which has been below replacement for a couple decades, and that has a rapidly aging workforce. And then you have China, where since the 1970s, they've had a policy of one child per family, which of course is an enforced 1.0 children per woman birth rate. And they have even though they have a lot of younger workers, because a lot of those workers are in their 20s. I think it really came into effect more in the late 70s and 80s, but there's not another generation coming up behind it. So China is going to have a rapidly aging workforce too, and I think you're going to find that a lot of the cheap labor in China is going to dry up and disappear. Oddly enough, Latin America, people don't realize it, even Mexico is having a falling birth rate. Of course, their birth rate is still above replacement rate, but eventually there won't be a pool of immigrants, and we may regret that, in that we may have to support ourselves in our old age. Right now, we have this a lot of immigrants coming in, a lot of immigrants having American born children, which means legal Americans, American citizens, and there is another generation, at least in our case, we're about 2.3 or 2.4, which is slightly above replacement rate, which is good. 2.1 apparently is replacement rate. So that, you know, we're at least somewhat, even though we're going to have a larger and larger cohort of old people all retired, and many of them sick, the largest expanding industry in the United States right now is healthcare. And of course, that absorbs a lot of undocumented aliens or illegal immigrants or whatever you want to call them too. So it's a very weird situation, and it's hard to say how that's going to work, but that's the way it is. So what else do we have to look forward to? Well, to be honest with you, on Monday, which is probably the day after you're going to see this show, there's going to be a gigantic demonstration in Phoenix, smaller but still considerable demonstration, expecting 10,000 people in Tucson. Tucson has had demonstrations for the last week, kind of ended Thursday and Friday, or Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, because they were having Ames tests. But that's going to start back up on Monday. And then apparently there's other demonstrations that are going to be happening all around the country. I thought that this bill in the Senate, because there would be a House-Senate conference, and the conference is where the final law actually takes place. People think, oh, when they vote for it, that's going to be what the law is. But that's not true. The Senate votes for one version, the House votes for a different version, then there's a conference, and that's picked by the leadership of the House and Senate. In this case, both sides are Republicans. And then they negotiate what the final law is going to be. So if the Senate had passed that bill, probably wouldn't have happened that we would have ended up with 11 to 12 million brand new felons on our hands. That would be clogging up the courts. I can just imagine the police chasing 11 to 12 million brand new criminals who right now are basically committing a civil offense, but not yet a misdemeanor, which is under a year in jail, or a felony, which is over a year in jail. So it's hard to say what's going to happen now. The other possibility is the Senate can pass nothing. And that is a distinct possibility. If the House passes a bill, the Senate doesn't, then in the House, they've had all the fun of passing an anti-immigrant bill. They get to go to their constituents who can't stand this idea that all these immigrants are running around speaking the foreign languages and all this other stuff. And they get to grandstand about it and make a big deal about it, how they tried to make all these people into felons, and they got knocked down. That would be one solution, and it wouldn't affect anything. It would be just the status quo ante all the way through, with one minus in that part of both bills is to increase the Border Patrol, which we really, really need, and to increase the fencing along the border, which is a very expensive operation, and which I personally support. I don't have a problem with it. It should be more difficult to smuggle drugs or whatever to get over the border. I don't have a problem with that at all. However, once we do seal the border, and there's a very good article in here that showed it, the number of people that just come here to work and then go back are going to fall to almost zero. As it is, because in the 80s, the big crossing points were San Diego and El Paso, where you could basically climb a link fence right in the middle of a town, land on the American side, which was a Mexican neighborhood too, and then walk to wherever you wanted to go, to the bus station, and go to your job. Well, we put very, very high fences along the more traditional border spots, like San Diego and El Paso, Brownsville, Texas, and so on and so forth, Laredo, and made it much more difficult to pass through these urban areas. And then as a result, now the immigrants are coming across the Arizona desert. Deaths in the desert are up to 400 people a year, people who literally thirst to death or die of exposure out in the desert, and trying to get to civilization. A lot of people just looking for water will turn themselves in by the time they get up to Tucson or back to civilization cells or someplace like that. So there's a lot more people dying on the border because of this. But and according to this study, in olden times, back in the 80s, if a undocumented Mexican worker came over the border, he had a 50% chance of going home. He would work a little while, he'd go home. If he ran out of money, he'd come back. And a lot of this whole thing was millions of undocumented workers coming over the border. A lot of those people are coming over the border 5 or 6 times. However, since they've increased security on the border, what we have is a situation where undocumented workers, instead of 50% going back within 24 months, now only 25% go back, because they know if they go back, it's going to be a lot harder for them to come back. So once we really do secure that border, we put that fence along the whole border, we militarize it, none of these people are going to go back, basically. And if they're forced to become felons, it's going to be a lot of trouble. And I don't know if we're willing to have all the policemen in the entire country start banging on doors and knocking down doors, and with the threat that we're going to throw these people in jail for 5 years or 10 years or whatever Sensenbrenner had in mind. It could get dicey. There's a lot of people who would, basically say, okay, you got me, put me on a bus, send me back over the border. If they're going to go to jail for 3 or 4 years, there might be a lot more trouble. I hope not, but I just don't think it's a good idea. If they are arrested, I have a feeling, though, and they do make it into a felony, there's so few federal courts, almost all the federal courts that are out there now are handling drug cases. They would have to stop arresting all drug dealers in the entire country, because the courts, the federal courts, would be so clogged up with immigration cases.